Hello everyone, welcome to Whispering Image. Today I will tell you true horror story. I've always considered myself pretty rational. I never believed in ghosts, and real horror stories always felt overblown. Until last year when I moved into a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood in the US Midwest. I thought I was escaping city crime and chaos for someplace peaceful. Instead, I found something much worse. My neighbor next door and everything he brought with him changed my life. It started small. I'd just rented a modest 2-story home. Safe, suburban, an American dream on paper. There was a wide lawn, white picket fence, and a row of tidy hedges dividing my yard from my neighbor's. I barely noticed the guy at first. He was always home, but he never waved, never introduced himself. He'd just watch through his faded curtains anytime I stepped outside. Not friendly, but not threatening. At least, that's what I thought. The first unsettling night came early in spring. I was unpacking boxes late, the streets silent except for distant crickets. That's when I heard footsteps on my gravel driveway. I froze and peeked out through the blinds. My neighbor stood beneath a flickering street lamp only a few feet from my porch, staring straight at my window. Not moving, not blinking, just staring with this hollow, fixed expression. I thought maybe it was a mistake, a lost pet or late-night cigarette. But this happened again, night after night. I'd see him outside, always facing my house. Sometimes he'd pace quietly, sometimes just stand there for an hour, motionless, like a statue. I was creeped out, but I couldn't prove he was doing anything illegal, so I said nothing. One Tuesday, I left for work before sunrise and noticed muddy footprints on my front steps, large boot-shaped prints trailing back towards his side yard. I knocked on his door that afternoon, wanting to clear the air. He opened barely a crack, just enough for his pale, bloodshot eyes to peer out. He said, "Stay inside after dark." Then he slammed the door so hard it rattled the glass. That was the last time he ever spoke to me. Things got weirder. Most nights I heard scraping sounds, like metal dragging along my fence post. Sometimes I swear I heard whispers on the wind, muttering my name. One weekend, after another night of his eerie presence, my motion lights flickered to life around 2 a.m. I watched through my phone's security camera as he circled my house, stopping at the basement windows, just staring in. I called the police, desperate for help. They arrived, but by then he was back inside his house, lights off. All they could do was take a statement. A few days later, a neighbor across the street told me she'd seen him digging in the backyard after midnight in the pouring rain. She said she'd heard crying coming from the hole he was digging. That's when I began to suspect there was more to his story. I started searching public records. Turns out, my neighbor, Leonard, was evicted from 3 previous homes for harassment and odd behavior. There were rumors of missing pets, break-ins, and even an unsolved disappearance years ago. But nothing ever stuck to him. Everyone was too scared to press charges. One night, I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of banging on my back door. Not a knock, a full-force, body-slamming racket. I grabbed my phone, called 911, and pushed myself against the door, terrified it would cave in. The police arrived just in time and found Leonard still ramming his shoulder into it, his eyes wide and wild. They subdued him and found a rusty crowbar in his pocket, along with a piece of barbed wire. There were muddy handprints all over my windows and doors. They arrested him, but he was released the next day and returned home. Police told me they couldn't hold him longer unless I had video of him breaking and entering. I felt helpless. The sense of safety I'd moved for was gone. After his return, Leonard's behavior escalated. He'd leave strange objects on my porch, old, broken toys, dead birds, even rotten meat. He took to standing outside my gate when I left for work, just watching my car fade down the street. My friends stopped visiting. By summer, I was living in a state of constant dread. The worst night of my life came in August. I was alone watching TV when I heard footsteps in my attic. Heavy, slow, unmistakable. My heart hammered. The attic was locked and I lived alone. I crept upstairs with a kitchen knife, barely daring to breathe. As I reached the attic door, I saw a shadow move behind the crack, impossibly tall, stretching towards me. The door swung open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness and cold air. I shone my flashlight, but there was nobody there. Yet the floor was covered in muddy footprints, and at the center, a pile of dirt mixed with hair and the remnants of a half-burned photograph. The photo was of my own house, years before I'd moved in, with Leonard standing in front, holding a shovel. That night, something changed. I couldn't sleep. Every shadow looked like his face. I kept hearing noises, footsteps above my ceiling, tapping at my windows. My neighbors stopped going outside at night. His lights were always on, but I never saw movement, never heard voices, never a trace of another human being. I decided to set up cameras around my property, desperate for proof. For weeks, nothing happened. Then one night, I woke to an alert. Movement. I opened the live feed and saw Leonard standing at my back gate with a shovel, digging into the earth. I called the police. They arrived just as Leonard disappeared behind his house. Searching the backyard, they found a fresh pit, half covered with a tarp and lined with metal spikes. A hastily scrawled note lay inside. "You were supposed to leave." I moved out the next day, finding a short-term rental in the city. On my last morning in the house, I watched from the window as Leonard stood on his porch, grinning and waving. As I drove away, I looked back one last time. His front door was wide open, but the interior was pitch black, deeper than ordinary shadow, as if the house itself refused to let the sunlight in. Since then, I've had nightmares almost every night. Sometimes, in my dreams, I see Leonard's face in the window. Sometimes I hear footsteps in the ceiling. One time I woke to the sound of scraping metal only to find muddy boot prints outside my apartment door. I never found out exactly what Leonard was doing, what he might be hiding beneath all that dirt in his backyard, or what happened to the family who lived in my house before me. But when people ask why I left my perfect suburban neighborhood, I tell them the truth. Some places look safe, but harbor darkness you can't imagine. If your neighbor warns you to stay inside after dark, you should listen. Because sometimes the scariest ghosts are the ones who are still alive, and they're standing just next door. I always thought the people living next door were just normal neighbors with normal lives, raising kids, going to work, living the suburban dream like everyone else. But sometimes, normal hides something much darker underneath, something that you only learn about when it's too late. This is my story, about the neighbor I never really knew, and about the nights I started to wonder if I had moved right next to a nightmare. I moved into a quiet neighborhood in the Pacific Northwest about 2 years ago. It was an old neighborhood filled with tall fir trees, creaky sidewalks, and houses that have been around for decades. One thing I loved about it was how peaceful it felt. Even the traffic seemed to slow down amidst the towering evergreens. My neighbor's house was a few steps away from mine. From the outside, it looked like most of the others. A little run-down, paint peeling on the edges, a lawn overgrown with weeds. But the strangest thing was how empty it felt. The windows were always covered by thick curtains. Never any signs of life, like kids' toys or bikes, or even a car in the driveway. In fact, the driveway was empty almost all the time. Except sometimes, late at night, when headlights would flash inside. The neighbor himself was a middle-aged man. I never saw him during the day, only brief glimpses after dark. Tall, hunched, shuffling in old clothes. He didn't even look at me when I waved. It was like he didn't want to be noticed. At first, I shrugged it off. Everyone has their quirks. But then, the weird stuff started. One cold autumn night, I was lying in bed scrolling on my phone when I heard a faint tapping, like nails on wood, coming from the wall that connected our houses. I paused and listened. It stopped, Then started again, sporadic, almost like a Morse code. I got up and looked out my window. The neighbor's house was pitch black, except for a dim, flickering light from the basement window. I shivered. The air was thick with an unusual stillness. Over the next few weeks, the tapping got worse. It became rhythmic, insistent. I talked to other neighbors, but nobody else seemed to notice anything. They all said the house looked abandoned. But I felt like something was there. I could feel it in the creaks, the shadows, that tapping, like a secret trying to get out. Then came the yelling. It was barely audible, but unmistakable. A wife's shout? A child screaming? Or something else entirely? I wasn't sure. It only happened on certain nights, always after midnight, lasting just long enough to give you chills down your spine before abruptly stopping. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and snuck outside to the side of his house, my heart racing in the silence. I pressed my ear to the wall, desperate to hear whatever was inside. The tapping stopped, and I heard faint breathing, slow and ragged. Then a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was desperate. I stepped back, suddenly aware how exposed I was. Whatever that was, whatever he was hiding, it wasn't normal. I decided then that it was time to keep my distance. Things escalated a month later. My front porch light started flickering every night. At first, I thought it was just faulty wiring. But on one particularly windy evening, I saw a shadow standing by my gate. Not a person. Or at least, not quite. This figure was motionless, tall and strangely distorted, like a glitch in the air. I blinked, and it was gone, but my blood ran cold. The next morning, I found strange symbols scratched into the wooden fence dividing our yards. They looked like ancient, cryptic signs, carved deep as if someone had used a nail or a knife. I had no idea what they meant, but I knew I had to document them. Not wanting to feel helpless, I started filming the outside of my house every night. After all, you hear stories about creepy neighbors, but who would believe me without proof? About 2 weeks after I started, I recorded something I can't explain. Around 3 a.m., the camera caught my neighbor standing outside holding a large, ragged doll, the kind you'd expect a kid to play with, except he wasn't acting like a normal person. His movements were jerky, unnatural. He rocked the doll back and forth slowly, whispering to it. Then, without warning, he dropped the doll and looked directly at the camera, his eyes glowing an unnatural yellow. I felt frozen watching it back. The footage made my skin crawl. I showed the video to a few close friends, hoping for support. One of them told me about a local urban legend that there was a man in these parts who dabbled in dark rituals involving children's spirits, that he kept those spirits trapped in dolls, using them as vessels to do his bidding. I tried to laugh it off, but my heart was pounding. Was this all coincidence? Or was I living next door to someone messed up in ways you couldn't imagine? One day, while leaving for work, I saw my neighbor's basement door wide open. This was unusual. It was the first time I had seen any part of his house without the curtains shut. Inside, the basement was lit by dozens of candles. The smell hit me first, like damp earth and something metallic like blood. I almost turned to leave, but curiosity pushed me a few steps closer. Through the fog of candles and shadows, I could make out dozens of dolls, hundreds of them, covering shelves, the floor, hanging from strings. Some had cracked faces, others missing eyes or limbs. Each one looked dirty and old, some with moss growing on them. At the center of the room was a small altar. A framed photo lay there, a picture of a little girl, pale and sad, her eyes strangely dark. Below the frame were burnt-out matches, scattered black feathers, and a rusty knife. I stumbled back and ran to my car, heart hammering harder than ever. That night, I recorded knocking sounds from the basement wall, chanting almost inaudible but unmistakably there. My neighbor was definitely not alone in that house. The breaking point came on Halloween night. I was home alone, the house quiet except for the wind rattling the windows. Around midnight, I heard pounding on my door, 3 sharp knocks, then silence. I looked through the peephole, but no one was there. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the whole neighborhood into darkness except for my phone's flashlight. I shone it down my sidewalk and gasped. There, at the end of the street, stood my neighbor. Only this time he wasn't alone. Behind him were dozens of shadowy figures. They didn't quite look human, more like dark wisps of smoke shaped like children, their eyes glowing faintly in the night. They circled around him, whispering. Frozen in fear, I watched as he lifted his arms and began a chant. The shadows swirled and grew, then suddenly all vanished with a lightning strike that shook the neighborhood. I slammed the door, locked every lock, and sat shaking in the dark until the power came back on hours later. The next morning, police came to check on me after neighbors reported strange noises and lights. I told them everything, showed the video. They took statements and said they'd investigate. But the house was empty when they checked. 4 years. The previous owner had disappeared with no trace, and no records of any children living there. My neighbor? Gone. No forwarding address, no sign he ever existed. To this day, whenever I walk past that abandoned house, I feel eyes watching me. Sometimes at night, faint laughter echoes on the wind, like children playing. I've learned a hard lesson. Sometimes the scariest neighbors aren't just creepy. There's something else entirely. Something that drags darkness wherever they go. And in neighborhoods like mine, some stories are better left alone.
I never imagined that moving to a new neighborhood could change my life, or what I thought was reality, forever. What started as a hopeful, fresh start turned into something nightmarish, something so dark and surreal that even now, thinking about it makes my blood run cold. This story is about my new neighbor, the man who appeared out of nowhere, who brought with him a shadow I couldn't explain. It's a true story, one that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. So sit tight and let me take you back to the beginning, to the day I moved in and the days that followed, when everything started to unravel. I moved to a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Seattle. It was the kind of place that looks perfect in real estate photos. Quiet streets, lined with trees, neatly kept homes, friendly neighbors waving as you passed by. Or so it seemed. My house backed up against a thick line of woods, tall pine trees that creaked and swayed with the wind. The neighbors were all friendly, or so I thought. It was a chilly October afternoon when he arrived. The first time I saw my neighbor, he was moving boxes into the house next door. He worked alone, dressed in faded clothes, hat pulled low over his face. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. There was something off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. He didn't say hello when I waved, just nodded and kept working. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I'd hear noises, footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway, slow tapping against the walls, whispers so faint I wasn't sure if I imagined them. It was always late at night, between 2 and 3 a.m. One night, I woke up to my dog growling at the window. When I looked outside, I saw something moving between the trees at the edge of my yard. It was tall, thin, and moved with jerky, unnatural motions, almost like it wasn't fully human. I called out, but it disappeared before I could finish my sentence. I began to notice my neighbor was never seen during the day. He'd only come out once night had fallen. And those nights, there was always some kind of strange ritual or activity. I started paying more attention. His porch light would flicker on and off, casting eerie shadows against the old wood. I caught sight of strange symbols scratched into the siding, geometric shapes, lines forming a pattern that looked ancient, sinister. My curiosity quickly turned into fear. One weekend, I decided to try and meet him to bridge the gap, hoping his strange behavior was just loneliness or mental illness. I walked up to his door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder. The door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway. Inside, the house smelled of mold, decay, and something metallic like dried blood. I stepped in and called out, but silence was my only reply. Suddenly, a cold breeze blew past me, though all the windows were shut. My skin prickled, and I heard a faint voice whisper, "Leave." I stumbled back outside and ran to my car, not daring to look back. After that night, my dreams turned horrific. I dreamed of being trapped in a forest, chased by a figure cloaked in darkness. Its eyes glowed red, and every time I tried to escape, the trees grew thicker, closing in around me. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. At the edge of the woods behind my house, I started finding strange totems, small animal skulls, twisted tree branches bound together with string, feathers, and little scraps of cloth tied with red ribbons. They weren't there before. Someone had been placing them. One evening, I noticed something terrifying. A circle of candles lit up through my security camera, arranged in a perfect ring on my neighbor's lawn. In the middle, his silhouette stood motionless. Suddenly, the candles all went out at once, plunging the lawn into darkness. Then, one by one, candles relit, but this time they floated just above the ground, hovering eerily. I showed the footage to a local law enforcement officer. He said, "People call that witchcraft." I felt the weight of gray settle heavier on my chest. The most horrifying moments came one night in November. The wind was howling outside, rattling my windows and shaking the floorboards, when I heard something, or someone, banging on my back door. Hard, emergent. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Peeking through the window, I saw him, my neighbor. His face was pale, almost ghostly, eyes blank like a corpse. He held a twisted wooden staff carved with the same strange symbols I'd seen on his house. He pointed it at my door, and the wood began to splinter and crack as if touched by some unseen force. I ran to grab my phone, but slipped.
He was there before I could get up, shrouded in shadows. I don't remember much after that. I blacked out. When I woke, I was inside my house, the door broken into splinters. The staff was lying on my floor. The windows were smeared with something dark and sticky. I don't want to say what. I called the police. They found no sign of my neighbor, but they took the staff as evidence. Later, an expert told me it was ancient, cursed, linked to rituals meant to trap souls. I couldn't understand any of it. That night, I packed everything I owned. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stay. But before I left, I took one last look outside. Under the pale moonlight, my neighbor's house was empty. No sign of movement, except a single candle burning on the porch. When I returned weeks later from a hotel, the house was gone. Literally gone. The land where his house had been was empty dirt with patches of burnt grass and ash. Locals said the house had been abandoned for years. that no one knew had moved in, and that several people before me had left after experiencing strange phenomena. Even after I left, I feel eyes watching me. Sometimes at night I hear whispers just outside my window. I still see shadows moving in the corners of my vision. I don't know if he was human, or if something else stomped the earth wearing his skin. But I do know this. Some neighbors aren't just people. They're warnings. And sometimes, you're the unlucky one who gets to live next door. If you liked this story, please hit the like button. Comment below with your own creepy neighbor stories. I'd love to hear if anyone else has had experiences like this. And if you want more real horror stories, be sure to subscribe for new videos every week. Thanks for listening, and remember, some doors are better left unopened.